even the crucifix, would be removed. How did the designers of this church know, 2 years before the fact, that Pope Paul VI would introduce a new Mass? How could they possibly know such a thing when the new Mass was being rejected by the world's bishops, even as the church was being completed? As becomes immediately evident, the design of this church cannot be laid at the feet of Bonini, the Protestant consultants, or Pope Paul VI. But that does not mean that the real architects of the new Mass and the architects behind the design of this church are not one and the same. As we continue our search for those responsible for the introduction of the new Mass into the Roman Rite, we need to look briefly at some historical characters. The first of these is John Wycliffe, a 14th century English Catholic priest who was trained on the continent as well as in his native country. Wycliffe was the first of his age to propose that the Bible alone was the sufficient rule of faith. He spread his particular brand of heresy almost 200 years before Martin Luther, and he gained a following of itinerant preachers known as Lollards. Wycliffe was the first to translate the Bible into English, and Protestant historians refer to him as the morning star of the Reformation. In the end, he denied his own priesthood, the whole of the Catholic faith, and in particular the real presence of Christ in the Holy Eucharist. We focus on him briefly because he was the harbinger of the Protestant revolt. Jan Hus lived in the 15th century, followed Wycliffe along the same path of sola scriptura, but retained his belief in the Holy Eucharist and the sacramental system. Like Wycliffe, Hus espoused translations of the Bible in the common language of the people. Hus also insisted that Holy Communion should be received by everyone under both species, the host and the cup, the body and the blood of Christ. He was ultimately burned at the stake for his heresy. The next fellow who becomes a part of this is this man, Johann Gutenberg. He is part of this because he invented movable type printing. His most notable work, a 42-line-a-page Bible. And if that seems a minor task or that it wasn't important, consider this. The project was begun in 1452 and completed by 1455. Working a normal workday, which at the time was 12 hours, it took 2 craftsmen more than 37 workdays just to prepare the initial type. At this rate, more than 3 years were needed to complete just 200 copies of Gutenberg's Bible. The next 2 characters we will consider together, Girolamo Savonarola, a Spanish Dominican friar, and Rodrigo Borgia, whose mother was the sister of Alfonso Borgia, Pope Calixtus III. Rodrigo was made a cardinal at the age of 25 by his uncle, and was elected Pope Alexander VI at age 61, after having fathered at least 4 illegitimate children. The reason we look at these 2 men at all is this statement made publicly by Savonarola against the worldliness, excesses, and humanism that had grown among churchmen in his time, and especially Pope Alexander VI. In these days, prelates and preachers are chained to the earth by the love of earthly things. The care of souls is no longer their concern. They are content with the receipt of revenue. The preachers preach to please princes and to be praised by them. They have done worse. They have not only destroyed the church of God, they have built up a new church about their own patter. Go to Rome and see. Dost thou not know what I tell thee? What doest thou, O Lord? Arise and come to deliver thy church from the hands of devils, from the hands of tyrants, from the hands of iniquitous prelates. Like Hus, Savonarola was burned at the stake. In our exploration for those who are responsible for the introduction of the new Mass, why have we turned to Wycliffe, Hus, and Gutenberg? Well, it is because of a single word, participation. It is a word that we are going to hear a lot of as we continue along this path. Wycliffe and Hus claimed it was lacking in their day. And in an important way, Gutenberg, through his printing press, made it possible. As for Savonarola and Pope Alexander VI, well, They're included here merely to provide a clear example of other times of great crisis within the Church, times not unlike our own. For despite the efforts of certain men, the Church survives. And the end of the reign of Alexander VI would see the seeds planted by Wycliffe in Huss take root and grow. Not 20 years after Savonarola was burned at the stake, the German priest and doctor of theology Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg. With this act, of course, the revolt of the protesters began in earnest, and a whole procession of them followed. Philip Melanchthon, Ulrich Zwingli, Thomas Cranmer, John Wesley, John Calvin, and dozens, even hundreds of others. As I mentioned earlier, Wycliffe was the first to translate the Bible into English. Then came Luther, who, once making his break with the Church, published one edition of the German Bible after the other, as well as his own new version of the Mass. Luther, in turn, was followed in this endeavor by the heresiarch Cranmer, who, in establishing the Church of England, published his own version of the Mass in the Book of Common Prayer. All of this brings us back to where we began, with the two Masses being offered, one after the other. The first distinction to be made is the direction the priest is facing. In the traditional Latin Mass, the priest faces the same direction as the faithful, as it were, leading them in the prayer of the Mass. In his book, The Reform of the Roman Liturgy, Monsignor Klaus Gamber, arguably one of the most respected Catholic liturgical experts of the 20th century, quotes St. Augustine. "When we rise to pray, we turn east, where heaven begins. And we do this not because God is there as if he had moved away from the other directions on earth, but rather to help us remember to turn our mind toward a higher order, that is, to God." Gamber goes on to explain that this quotation shows that the Christians of those early days, after listening to the homily, would rise for the prayer which followed and turn toward the east. St. Augustine always refers to this turning to the east in prayer at the end of his homilies using a set formula, converse ad Dominum, turn to face the Lord. According to Gamber, Martin Luther was the first person to demand that the priest at the altar face the people. He cites Luther's The German Mass and Order of Worship, which the heresiarch published in 1526. Luther writes, "Let all the vestments, the altar, the candles be, until they get used up, or we decide to change them. And if somebody wants to do things differently, let him do it. But for the real Mass among true Christians, the altar should not remain in its current form, and the priest should always face the people." That brings us to the second primary distinction to be made between the two Masses, that of the language.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen, introibo auditari Dei.
In the traditional Mass, the language is Latin. In the Mass of Paul VI, although the Mass was promulgated in Latin, it is said virtually everywhere in the common language of the people.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
So that we might be able to better understand this, let us return to the protesters and to those who followed them. The Protestant revolutionaries were succeeded in this thinking about updating the Mass by the followers of Cornelius Jansen, a Belgian Catholic theologian whose beliefs in absolute predestination paralleled Calvin's. Jansenists throughout the 16th and 17th century, seeking a more austere mode of worship, encouraged the removal of religious objects which they considered distractions from Catholic churches. They insisted that there be but one bare altar in every plain and bare church, one Mass only on Sunday, and that Mass